Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Monica Staaf, and I'm the General Counsel of the Rhode Island Association of Realtors. And I'm here today with John Breault, the Vice President of Statewide MLS. We also have a special guest who I will introduce in greater detail in a few minutes. But the short introduction is Ryan Antrop, the chair of our Forms Committee. So Ryan will be spending most of the time today having Ryan review the changes to the forms that you'll be using starting on August 14th. I think that just stuck in my throat. We had some wild number of people signed up today. John, what was it? 670?
673 at last I looked. Yep. So,
Yeah, we'll see if I don't know that everyone will necessarily turn up, but
yeah.
Okay, so I just have a few housekeeping announcements and I'll tell you what to expect today and certainly save time for your questions. So our program today, this is our settlement drop-in with special guest. Yay. We're going to go till 5:30 p.m. today. If you do have questions, you probably heard this before when we've done these Zoom presentations, but we're not going to be able to unmute you. Put your questions in the Q&A. So you'll find the Q&A on my computer. It's at the bottom of the screen, but that's where you want to type your question. And so we will take questions. We'll want to give Ryan a chance to talk about some of the forms first, but we will be taking questions for any of us or all of us. All right. I think the only other thing I need to mention is actually John just posted this in the chat that you can see. And that is, since this is being recorded, you'll be able to view it on the website that is there. If you're used to going to RIAR.org to look at the compensation, the latest updates on the antitrust settlement agreement, compensation issues, et cetera, it's on that same website, and that is where it'll be posted. So at this point, I'm going to check the Q&A really quickly because we already have a question. Oh, nope, that was a thank you. All right. You're welcome, Sheila. All right, we already have a thank you before we've even said anything. That is optimism, my friends. Okay, I'm going to turn things over to John Breault. We'll share his PowerPoint, which he does a great job with. I'll give a quick legal update after John, and then most of the program will be our star guest, Ryan Antrop. Go ahead, John.
All right. Thank you, Monica. Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to spend a little bit of time sort of rehashing a little bit, but that obviously explains, how did we get here? We know, of course, about the settlement. We're not really going to spend a lot of time with that. Our primary focus really, which will lead into forms, will be focusing on two of the practice changes that we, and in turn you folks, will be required to adhere to under the settlement. These will be implemented. The effective date is August 14th. So as many of you were aware, the settlement deadline was that we had to implement these changes by August 17th. August 17th being a Saturday didn't seem like a great time to make changes, so we've opted for August 14th. And so the changes really center in major part around two things. First, that compensation is being removed from the MLS. So effective August 14th, when you log into Matrix, there will no longer be any compensation information anywhere on any listings, active, off-market listings, historical information. That information is being removed entirely from the Matrix. So you'll no longer have access to any compensation information. This means obviously also when you enter a listing, you are no longer permitted to offer cooperative compensation through the MLS. So those fields won't be there, but you're also prohibited from putting information in the remarks or attaching a document or anything like that. There can be no compensation or references to compensation in the MLS anywhere. So that's a hard stop. Boom. No longer permitted. What the settlement does permit or does not prohibit is the broker-to-broker compensation outside of the MLS. So brokers who desire to compensate other brokers outside of the MLS, it is still permitted. How you handle that is entirely a broker-to-broker decision. We do want to point out this little caveat here. I think we're probably mostly aware is the DOJ, the Department of Justice, has made it pretty clear that the settlement really doesn't go far enough, and that they really think broker-to-broker compensation should be prohibited altogether. Is that a fair assessment, Monica? Anything you want to add to that? You're nodding. Yes.
I'm nodding vigorously.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, it's unfortunate, but something that actually just happened in the last few weeks is the Department of Justice contacted the California Association of Realtors and actually briefly stopped them from launching their forms changes because the Department of Justice felt the changes didn't go far enough. And we did compare all of the forms changes of the MLS listing agreements, the RIAR purchase and sales agreements, buyer representation agreement, other forms. We did compare this with what the Department of Justice raised as concerns in the California case, but still it was startling for a lot of people to see a huge state like that the Justice Department would take them on. So they are definitely out there paying attention and actively paying attention to what associations are doing and also what brokerages and companies are doing.
Yeah, and we'll dig into that a little bit more with the forms as we explain the form changes. But also there was some messaging from NAR where the President Kevin Sears and some other leadership also met with the Department of Justice, and they made it clear, as well as we've heard also from the plaintiffs' attorneys, that they're watching, right? They're watching us, and they're looking to see if brokers or MLSs are finding a workaround to this and trying to sort of preserve compensation sharing in a way that's really prohibited from the settlement. So just some information there. We'll move ahead. So the next really big change is the mandatory written buyer agreements. So this is the requirement that before a buyer tours any home, that you must have a written agreement with them. It's not a mandatory buyer representation agreement. A lot of times it's referred to that as sort of the term of art. Monica and myself we've caught ourselves saying, mandatory buyer rep agreements, but they're not buyer rep agreements. They're written agreements with buyers that spell out a couple of things. There's a disclosure in there that sort of just generically says that compensation is not fixed by law, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also a requirement that you have to specify exactly the amount and rate of compensation that you will receive for the services you provide under that agreement. So let me briefly really talk about sort of these two triggers that trigger, because a lot of questions, I mean, maybe this is old news now and we figured it out, but might as well just address it while we're here, is, well, when do I need to have this? If somebody shows up at my open house, do I have to have them sign a buyer agreement or not? And so let's talk about these two triggers, the working with a buyer and touring a home. So working with a buyer, the guidance from NAR is it's participants who provide brokerage services to buyers. And those are identifying potential properties, arranging for the buyer to tour a property, negotiating on behalf of the buyer, and writing and presenting offers. So those are sort of what some of the things that are considered, quote unquote, working with a buyer. What is not working with a buyer is simply marketing your services or talking to a buyer who may show up at your open house or providing some other sort of unrepresented buyer access to view one of your listings. So if they want to see your listing, hey, I want to see your listing at 123 Main Street. Okay, you're not obligated to have them sign that written agreement. Now, doesn't mean you couldn't pursue that or do that anyway, if you choose to, but it's not mandated under these practice changes. And so the other trigger is touring a home. Well, what does that mean? Well, a home in this case means a residential property consisting of not less than one nor more than 4 residential dwelling units. So that's in our category, the residential multifamily, right? But it's not commercial listings. It's not even rentals, actually, because it's when we're talking about buying a home. We're not talking about renting a home. So when a buyer and or the real estate licensee physically enter the home, and it includes when licensees working with the buyer enter the home to provide a live virtual tour. So the buyer is not physically present, but the buyer broker on their behalf is walking through with and doing sort of a visual or live virtual tour of the property. So with that, that's a real quick 1, 2, 3, but we really don't want to, we want to spend as much time as possible on the new forms. So Monica, with that, I'm going to just turn it over to you, unless there are some questions specifically that you think I need to answer at this point. I haven't really been looking at the questions just yet.
Yeah, John, I'd say that there's two, if you wouldn't mind addressing briefly.
Okay.
One is about remarks.
Yeah. So you can't.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't. If you want to read the question, that's fine. But if not,
sure, yeah.
Go ahead.
On MLS after August 14th, either in public remarks or in the showing instructions area, can there be verbiage stating that the seller is offering concessions to the buyer? And there are also questions about compensation too.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, you can't use the word compensation. You can't say compensation. I mean, concessions are different. The settlement does allow for concessions, where the seller is offering a concession to the buyer. However, the concession can't be a concession in total for cooperative compensation. So concessions can be for all the things we know to be concessions, and can include a portion of the concessions could be used for the buyer to pay the buyer broker. But the offer of a concession can't be prohibited. Basically, you can't substitute, well, we'll just call it a concession, but really what we're doing is offering cooperative compensation. Is that fair to say, Monica? That sound right?
Yes.
Good. Okay, there was another question.
The only other quick one, and then there are other ones that we will hold for a little bit later on, just so we don't have too much time, but they're all great questions. And just seeing a theme. This is one about that one person mentions that she's licensed in multiple states. One of the other states is adding a seller concession field.
Yeah. So
I mean, what's our approach to that?
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. Look, I mean, if you want to add, I mean, we just said, if your seller is offering concessions, you can put that in remarks. The challenge with, some of these MLSs, there's a sort of this in California, there was an MLS that came up with, hey, we got this great idea. We'll have concession fields, that there's a concession, and it can be a flat dollar amount or a percentage. And, it sort of, it starts to look an awful lot like you're just, you're sort of finding a workaround. You're calling it concessions, but it gives the impression that you're really just trying to find another way to keep cooperative compensation going. I mean, if there was a need for concession field, the timing is just suspect, right? I like to say it's sort of like, does it pass the smell test? Why all of a sudden, with compensation going away, our MLS is deciding that there's a sudden need for concession fields where they've never had that need before. Concessions aren't new, right? And generally concessions, I mean, you folks are the professionals, not me, but how do concessions generally come up in a transaction, in the individual transaction, right? I mean, how often are you sort of front loading an offer of concessions? Does that happen a lot? I mean, maybe it does, but in those circumstances where, I guess in the discussion with the seller, if the seller says they're willing to, offer some concessions, you can put that in the remarks. Simply, sellers willing to offer concessions up to a certain amount, and that's fine. It just seems troublesome. What we don't want to have happen, I guess, is in 3 years, the Department of Justice and the plaintiffs look at the industry and say, "It's gee whiz, compensation is still too high in our opinion, right? Compensations haven't dropped." And then they start trying to find reasons, well, or excuses, or just another reason they're supposed to come after MLSs or the association in general, is to say, well, what happened? Well, all of a sudden MLSs started adding concession fields, and oh, look, we start looking at these concessions, and all these concessions seem to be in this range of this percent, and it just seems to be a bit troubling. So it's not to say that at some point, if for some reason there is a solid business need that we need to have data fields for concessions versus it just being in the remarks, then we could reevaluate it and say, well, from a business perspective, from a data management perspective, it makes sense to manage these through specific fields, but it doesn't seem like it's the way to go right now, just in our opinion.
Yeah, I just quickly add to that, then we'll move on to, I'll make a couple of comments about the forms committee, then we'll move on to Ryan. But, you know, an example of when you might want to include a seller might want to include a seller concession would be if a seller knows, for example, that the septic system is failing or the roof needs a lot of work, or there's a specific instance where the seller wants to set aside a dollar amount because they know it's going to make the property is going to be unattractive. You know what I mean? Because there's a big problem that needs to be repaired. But in general with concessions, I mean, you tell me, but in general with concessions, you know, how does the seller really want to put out a specific dollar amount without knowing what the offer is?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like I don't know how that conversation, again, you folks are the professionals, but I'm sort of wearing my seller hat. If a broker were to come to me and say, hey, John, you know, what do you think about offering concessions? I don't know. I mean, is there an offer on the table? It's like, if there's an offer on the table, let's talk. But it's sort of, are you willing to front load up to X amount of dollars? And, you know, I don't know. I mean, is that something that's really happening out there in the field? Is that maybe it's more likely to happen now? I don't know. But it just seems, I don't know, peculiar.
Okay.
Let me reshare my screen. Sorry.
Mr. John, and so I put in the chat that we will be sending, I know usually there are at least a few people who ask for the PowerPoint, so that will be sent out to everybody. Whether you want it or not. No, just kidding. That will be sent to everybody so you can have access because it does have some good information in there that John just shared. The main thing I'd like to mention is, well, actually a couple of things. One is the forms were all, in case you don't know, all of the forms, which we'll be talking about momentarily, were created by the Forms Committee. That's a group of volunteers who are your peers in different parts of the state, different types of practice areas. And I have to say, the Forms Committee has always been a hard-working committee. This is going to sound like an infomercial, but I want to say it anyway. Under Ryan Antrop's leadership of the Forms Committee, this year the committee's had, I want to say, probably 4 special meetings. They've been working on forms changes for months, starting last fall. And it seems like every time they're ready to make some changes, another shoe drops. So I really want to give the committee a lot of credit for all the work that they've done as volunteers, especially during some of these challenging times. The forms, I do want to mention what happened right before the 4th of July. All the forms were sent to the vendors at different times, but by the end of June. So the forms vendors that you might use, whether it's Transaction Desk, .loop, ZipLogic, some of the others, they all update the forms at different times. On July 3rd, the day before the holiday, mid-afternoon, one of my colleagues got an email saying, oh, we're going to make the forms live tonight. This was from .loop. And I said, no, we haven't done any outreach yet. You haven't heard from Ryan yet. So we contacted them. They said, oh, we made a mistake. We already made them live. So the decision that we made at the time was some of the forms, like the listing agreements that have more changes to them, decided not to, we asked them to reinstate the old forms until we have a chance to do the training. So everyone should be posting by around August 1st. And then you will see there's a change in the purchase and sales agreement. For those of you who have .loop, that change has gone live with a few others. And I will let Ryan discuss those. So on that note, I'm just going to remind everybody, it seems like you're doing a good job using it so far. Use the Q&A if you think of questions about anything you've heard so far or any questions you'd like for any of us. Put that in the Q&A. We won't be able to unmute you because we now have 414 people with us. So let me introduce Ryan. And for those of you who don't know Ryan Antrop, he has been a licensed real estate licensee in Rhode Island and Massachusetts since 2005. He's been the chair of the Realtor Association Forms Committee since 2021 and served on the committee for a number of years before that. Ryan is currently a broker associate with Residential Properties, where he has worked since 2012. And he was promoted to become the manager at the Cumberland office in 2019. So Ryan, turning things over to you, and we thank you so much for your time and all the work that you and the committee have done.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, John. Thank you for having me today. I don't know if you want to answer some of these questions real quick on here, Monica, or if you want me to jump into the forms.
I could just say some of the questions on here are about what to do during the transition, and also understandably concerns, how the heck are you going to get paid as a cooperating broker? I don't want you to think we've forgotten about those questions. I think that Ryan will answer some of those during his presentation, and anything that you still have questions on, we will go back and make sure all those questions are answered. So I think take it away on that note, Ryan.
All right, perfect. So, John, we're going to start with the exclusive right to sell listing agreement.
You got it.
And John is going to share the forms for us and show it as I go over the changes.
Bear with me.
Actually,
I'm
while you're doing that,
I'm
I see-
cracking under
sorry to-
pressure. Here we go.
No, you're doing fine, John. I'm already interrupting, which I know is terrible, but I just saw that 4 people had their hands raised, and we're not going to be able to call on you individually. So please just look for that Q&A button on my computer. It's at the bottom. And that's where you would type your question. You'll find other questions in there that people have already typed. And finally, if you're shy, you can change your name to anonymous before you post the question. So, okay, now I'm done. Go ahead, Ryan and John.
Awesome. Thanks, Monica. So John, if you could scroll down to section 6.
There you go. Look good?
Yeah, that's great. So section 6 is always been the what we've known as the compensation to listing broker section. The changes that were made here, there were virtually no changes in section A as we know it, except for changing the word compensation or commission to professional service fee, and also adding compensation is not fixed by law and is fully negotiable, which was part of the settlement that we had to do within the forms. What was added was E at the bottom, 6AE, and where it says that the listing broker shall not accept commission from more than one party, even if permitted by law, without disclosure to all parties and the informed consent of the seller. And I saw a question in there, so that this will go back to answer that as well, about receiving commission from different parties in the code of ethics and how you deal with that. Additional service, so section 7 was changed, and that is now additional professional service fees provisions. And this is where you would write in, let's say if you did want, if your firm was allowing or did decide to pay a cooperating broker, your seller was willing to put out there that they were willing to pay a cooperating broker, you could write that in this additional professional service fees provision section. Or any other, if a bonus was being offered, or if there were any changes to the professional service fee or additions to, this is where you could add such language. And then section 8, and you can see there that the seller has to initial that specifically. And then section 8 was drastically changed, where it's called other fees. And again, we needed to say that compensation is not fixed by law and is fully negotiable. And that we added that a potential buyer may ask seller to compensate a broker who is assisting or representing the buyer, or to contribute to the buyer's closing costs as a condition of the buyer's purchase of property. Any such agreement may be in writing. So this is kind of a, not a warning, but a highlight to the seller that you may be asked to participate with compensation to the buyer's agent, and that will come through within their offers. And then the rest was removed that we used to have in here, talking about how much of the total compensation being paid to the listing broker was going to be then attributed to the buyer's agent as a co-broke fee.
One thing I want to just comment on that, Ryan, just to make sure we're clear.
Yep.
On this other fees section, so just so everybody really understands it, because you understandably there's a lot to read here. You said any such agreement may be in writing, but the requirement is actually that it must be in writing, and that's an important distinction. I just want to make sure people understand that. So they're agreeing to whatever they're agreeing to in here. So, but if this other situation occurs, then it has to be done in writing.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep, absolutely. And we will see in a few minutes, we took care of that in the purchase and sale agreement.
Okay.
So yeah, the next form.
The amendment to listing agreement.
Yes, please.
Here we go. That look good?
Not yet.
Oh, did I not share my stuff? I pulled it up, but I forgot to hit share. Sorry. See?
Oh, John, and if you think of it, is there a way to increase the font size?
Yeah, I am. Was that last one not big enough? Is this good? There you go. Nice and big now, right?
That's big now. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'll watch the Q&A and see if the person can see it now, but. Okay, thank you.
No, so this is a brand new form. We've never had a specific amendment to the listing agreement before. So this is exactly what it says it is. It's an amendment to the exclusive listing agreement. Up top you have the sellers, the listing brokerage, the property address. And then you reference whether you're referring to the exclusive right to sell listing agreement or the exclusive right of brokerage. And then there are different checkboxes, or I'm sorry, the exclusive commercial listing agreement. And then there are different sections here that are specifically pulled out. Like if you want to if you're doing an extension to your listing agreement, the term of the agreement section, you can check that box and you can write in what the new term is going to be, listing broker duties, professional service fees to listing broker section, and then 2 other boxes if there's other sections that you are wishing to amend of that agreement. Previously, we would use our data form to do for example, an extension or even a price change. And that data form is not a required form. It's only required if you're sending it into MLS to have MLS update it for you. So this should be easier and make it a little easier, make a little more sense going forward, where it's a specific amendment to the agreement that you're working on.
And Ryan, if I could just mention quickly,
Yeah.
I know we saw a couple of questions in the Q&A about transition. We don't have to get into all the details now, but just wanted to comment that this will be a handy form for you to use, especially like if you have a listing contract that's offering compensation now, but you're not in a purchase and sales agreement or haven't closed by August 14th. This is a form that could come in handy to make some changes to your contract.
Right, if it's not impending by August 14th, right, there needs to be an amendment to your listing agreement.
Is that correct, Monica? Right? That's what we're
Yes.
saying. Because that's one of the questions we're getting. So, right. So when they would do what? Use this professional service fee section to make that amendment?
Could use the professional service fee section, and correct me if I'm wrong, do you not need to say that compensation is fully negotiable since it's not in the old listing agreement?
Yeah, I mean, technically you should probably amend it to add, that's a good point, right? Add that disclaimer in there that you're required to have.
Yeah.
By the way, some of the disclaimers that Ryan and John have been talking about, I think Ryan mentioned they're in the settlement agreement. I can just say that the Forms Committee literally went through a couple of pages of the settlement agreement that had a checklist, like you need to have this disclaimer, you need to have this disclosure, you can't have this. So the committee really went through that list.
So there's some questions in here about going back to section 7. Do we want to do that while people are?
You want me to bring it back up?
Yeah, please, John.
Section 7 of the exclusive right to sell?
Yes, please.
Yep.
You got it.
Yeah, that's fine, Ryan. If you're willing to take questions as we go along, that's
Probably a
fine.
good idea. So before, we move too far ahead, that way I'm not resharing and. All right, let's see. All right, there we go.
So section 7, additional professional service fees. There's a question here. So Amanda had a question, would section 7 be where you would add a transaction fee as well? I would say yes. I would say if it's any compensation coming from the listing from the seller, then yes, you would add, that would be the section that you would add that in. An anonymous would what would be the exact wording if a seller is offering compensation to a buyer's broker? I think that should be left up to the brokerage, and we should not, tell me I'm wrong, Monica, but that the individual brokerages should decide on that wording and not come from us.
And one thing I think, yes, I agree with you, Ryan. And I think one thing to be aware of, we've been mentioning the Department of Justice. If it were entirely up to the Department of Justice, which you can argue it is, they believe that the only time that compensation should be offered to a cooperating broker would be the buyer pays it or the seller pays it as part of negotiation, which you'll see when Ryan gets to the purchase and sales agreement. So in other words, they're like, according to the Department of Justice, they're saying you don't want to have any kind of general offer of compensation going from a listing broker or a seller to a cooperating broker. they want it to be individually negotiated. One thing I've mentioned as I've given some presentations with different offices is, some people say, well, what if we want to do it anyway? Every office has to make its own decision. I'd say that there are risks involved, and also keeping in mind that we're right next door to MLS PIN, which was sued, well, more than a year ago. And MLS PIN proposed some pretty radical changes to their MLS, which would have been having the seller make offers of compensation. The seller could even just completely change their mind about what they would offer for compensation if the seller didn't get a full price offer. And the Department of Justice has said multiple times now, that does not go far enough. So at that point, the proposed settlement agreement that MLS PIN has still has not even gotten preliminary approval by the court. So I guess the point is proceed with caution and anyway.
Yeah.
And Ryan, I had a couple of people have asked Ryan, you might have seen this, but they asked if you could explain section 7 again.
Yep, absolutely. So somebody else wrote in, can we write seller is flexible with buyer agents or just flexible? I don't think it's necessary, because as we get to the purchase and sale agreement and the letter of intent, you're going to see how one would ask for compensation to be paid for by the seller if that's the way the deal's going.
Right.
Is there a checkbox for net versus gross on listing broker compensation? No, we actually removed it. And everything you will see is based on gross going forward. So if you want to specifically, and same thing in the buyer's rep agreements, if you want to specifically collect on the net, you need to put that in there. It's just much easier regarding the way that the PNS is done now and everything, that everything is based on the gross.
Okay.
On the buyer's agreement, let's wait till the buyer's agreement.
Yeah, we can circle back if we need to right on these, maybe as we move forward.
I think that there are a number that can be answered when Ryan talks about the purchase and sales agreement.
Yeah.
Good.
They're all
Okay.
excellent questions, so please keep them coming.
All right. So, oops, I'm opening my email. See, I'm multitasking. Wrong icon. So we want the exclusive right to rent listing agreement. Is that correct?
Yes, please.
And away we go. Boom. So where do you want me to go?
We are going to be on section 16.
Ooh. Look at that. Oh, here we go.
So professional service fees, again, there, it's just the word, the compensation being taken out, being changed to professional service fees. Again, the compensation is not fixed by law and is fully negotiable. You're going to see that everywhere, wherever commission is a part of the agreement. Again, it says here, brokerage shall not receive a professional service fee that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to by landlord. This follows very closely the listing agreement. Section 17 is additional professional service fees. There's nothing different in section 16 than what was there previously, other than those minor changes. Section 17 is new, where additional professional service fee provision, which is the same thing as section 7 in the listing agreement that we just talked about. And then same thing with section 18 mirrors section 8 in the exclusive listing agreement, where compensation is not fixed by law, and a potential tenant may ask the landlord to compensate a broker who is assisting the tenant. Any such agreement must be in writing. Very familiar with the listing agreement as it goes along.
Excellent. Okay, so next we have the amendment to the rental listing agreement. Do we need to see that, or does that pretty much follow suit with the other?
I don't think
it basically follows the same format as the newly created amendment to the listing agreement, right?
It's a brand new form. Exactly, it is a brand new form. We never had an amendment to the rental agreement. So therefore, since we did one for the listing agreement, we created one for the exclusive right to rent as well. Yep, and there it is.
So there it is. Okay.
Same exact
Perfect.
form. that it did.
Excellent. Okay. Starting to get a rhythm now here. Let's see, commercial exclusive listing agreement.
Yes, please.
Right.
Actually,
Thing that
Ryan,
makes this one special is that it's blue. This is the one that has blue on it for some reason. Go
yes.
ahead. Sorry, Monica, I didn't mean to interrupt
Oh,
you.
I'm sorry. No, I was just going to ask really quickly. Ryan, there was a question, since we're talking about listing agreements. I don't know if
Yeah.
you want to tackle this one, but
Yep.
it's about what someone was asking, what's the difference between an exclusive right to sell versus an exclusive brokerage listing agreement?
I'll let you answer that one, Monica.
Okay, all right. John? No, I got it.
I can do it if you
Sorry.
want. I don't care. Go ahead.
No, I got it. Exclusive right to sell is if you're listing the property, if anyone buys the property, it could be the seller's family member, next door neighbor, someone whom you brought in, someone a cooperating broker brought in. The listing broker is entitled to compensation regardless, even if the seller just, someone just knocked on the seller's door. You're entitled to compensation. With the exclusive right of brokerage, essentially you're competing with your client for the buyer. So your buyer exclusive right of brokerage in general, if the seller finds, if it is the seller's family member or friend, the seller just puts up their own for sale sign and finds somebody, you wouldn't be entitled to compensation. The seller would have to document how they, when this person first approached them, how they knew them, all of that, but you wouldn't be entitled to compensation. So in general, to get yourself paid, the exclusive right to sell is the better option, but there are times where you may need to compromise and it's worthwhile for, maybe working with a builder or someone like that. There might be times you want to compromise on that. Sorry, Ryan, I didn't mean to stick
That's
with
okay.
it. I'll
So
stick to
where
the
am I headed?
forms.
Where am I
Section-
headed on this one?
Section 12, please. All right, so section 12, the title has been changed to professional service fees. It used to be compensation to listing broker. Again, you see there compensation is not fixed by law and is fully negotiable. Also was added a couple of sentences down, brokerage shall not receive any compensation from more than one party, even if permitted by law without disclosure to all parties in the informed consent of the seller. We took care of that in the purchase and sale agreement. This, I know we're talking about commercial right now, and we don't have a commercial purchase and sale agreement, but that language is taken care of. We changed in 1 and 2 below, it's changed to professional service fee instead of commission. Those are same changes as you go through section 12. And then we mimicked section 13 and section 14 after what we're all most used to, which is the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, where we have additional professional service fee provisions. And we have other fees, which reads the same, that a potential buyer or tenant may ask the seller or landlord to compensate a broker who's assisting or representing the buyer or tenant, and any such agreement must be in writing.
Right. Excellent. Now we're going to get into some meat here with the buyer rep agreement, right? So I'm sure we'll
Much
want
has
to.
changed in the buyer rep agreement from what we made
Oh.
changes recently. So
Here I am thinking it's all going to be, sorry.
yeah.
All right. Let me share this. Now, again, this is the buyer representation agreement. As I mentioned in my earlier presentation, what's mandatory is a written agreement with the buyer, not necessarily a buyer representation agreement, which this is, correct?
Correct. So this is the exclusive buyer representation agreement, which has been around, I don't know, for a very long time. We have added more, which we'll get to in a few minutes, of different forms for different types of situations with how you represent that buyer or could represent that buyer. But this is the same form that has been around for a long time. I know, it wasn't widely used, but it will start to be. Professional service fees, section 9, John. We've made some changes to this form recently after the lawsuit in October, November. So there's very minor changes to this form if you did start to use it once the lawsuit was heard at the end of, it was Halloween when we found out what was going on. So the changes here are section A. It now just says the following professional service fees shall be owed to brokerage firm under the conditions stated below. There was more language in here that we took out. It used to say if buyer enters into a contract to purchase a property to which the brokerage firm introduces the buyer and or assists the buyer. We thought that was just too much. It's if somebody's signing this agreement with a buyer's rep, they should be paid whether that person goes to an open house without them or the buyer agent has gone to every single appointment with them. And this is an agreement between the buyer and the buyer's representative on what compensation should be. This is the agreement, yes, that we believe will be used most often as your touring agreement that we've referred to, because this is the agreement that has the compensation in it. And again, you can see on top there, section 9, compensation is not set by law and is fully negotiable. This is the agreement that you need to have signed with any buyer before showing them the property, not open houses. I mean, there's the caveats, etc. But this is if you're going to be touring a buyer to properties, this is most likely the agreement that you're going to be using. And this is where the compensation has to be spelled out. Other changes in here are in section 9A3. We removed, you can't see it, but what we removed is that is offered. So it used to say buyer authorizes brokerage firm to collect the professional service fees that is offered to cooperating brokers by the listing broker or in a separate written agreement from the seller. It now just reads that buyer authorizes brokerage firm to collect professional service fees from the seller or other parties as part of the purchase and sales agreement. And it also says that broker shall not receive any professional service fee that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to by buyer, which is important that whatever you agree to in this buyer's representation agreement is the most that you can collect combined from any parties. And down below, section E, brokerage firm shall not accept a professional service fee from more than one party, even if permitted by law, without disclosure to all parties, the informed consent of the buyer. And this has been taken care of for you in the purchase and sale agreement, where there's a checkbox, and we'll see that in a few minutes, which allows you to make that disclosure appropriately.
Okay. Is that it? Or should we just see if there are any questions related to this before we move on?
Yeah, that's it in this agreement.
Yeah.
So why don't we see if there's any questions, because I'm sure there will be on this one. I'm just starting at the bottom here. Who's making sure the buyer's agents aren't double dipping? I don't have an answer for that. That is, well,
Actually, I think you do, Ryan, when you get to the purchase and sales agreement.
okay. Yep. You're right. And remember in that question of the double dipping that there's not compensation advertised anymore. So you're right, Monica. The purchase and sale agreement will deal with that, but don't think about it as today, where there's compensation being offered in MLS and you're being guaranteed. You know, I'll use the word guaranteed, but you're almost being guaranteed that plus whatever's in here. It's not going to work like that. So it's going to be harder. It'd be hard to double dip.
Here's one question I want to answer. It's sort of, I should have covered it earlier. We covered it in our previous sessions, but will listing agents get a copy of the buyer agreement? The answer is no. I mean, the requirement, the mandatory agreement with buyer it's an MLS rule under the settlement, so that that MLS reserves the right, like they do on the listing side, to audit a broker to see if they have an exclusive listing agreement with the seller. Well, on the same side, we have the right to audit a buyer broker to see if they have a written agreement with the buyer. That's an internal enforcement mechanism. We don't share that information. Likewise, there's no obligation on a listing broker to confirm the existence of that buyer agreement with the buyer. So if another brokerage or a real estate professional contacts you and wants to show a home, you have to let them show the home. You can't say, well, you've got to show me your agreement. You got to prove to me you have an agreement. That's not your right to do that. You could certainly, afterwards drop a dime to the MLS and say, hey, I think, this broker may not have an agreement, and then we would handle it under an enforcement of our rules. But you need to make the property available for showings, and you have no rights to see that buyer agreement.
I do see, thanks, John, and I do see one for Ryan, which is addressed by the settlement agreement too. That Bethany writes, can we use up to a certain percentage or not less than X?
No. So no, that it needs to be a specific number. That it either needs to be a specific percentage, a specific flat fee. It needs to be a specific number. It can't be it can't be up to, or you can't use words like that.
Right.
I think, related to that, if I could just add, I've been getting a lot of questions, and I think I neglected to give my standard antitrust disclaimer, which was for purposes of this, we don't want to get into actual numbers or percentages or anything like that. We don't need to set all of you up, all the attendees and the association and MLS up for a possible price fixing action. So we'll steer clear of that. But I have had some people ask me in the past month or so, let's say that I agree to, X amount for compensation in my buyer representation agreement. But then I find that a seller might be willing to pay me Y, which is more than the original amount. So can I do that?
If you can change the contract at any time. So, I mean, the short answer is yes. And you could use the amendment to do so. Just a couple of questions.
Exactly, yeah.
So here's one that's sort of related to, can you ask for confirmation of representation of buyer as the listing agent? This happens in the commercial market. So this is different. You're not asking to see the agreement, but you're asking for them to confirm that buyer representation. So would that be handled under the mandatory rep agency? Well, we don't call it agency, right? In this state. So
it's no different from today. We don't do that today. So no.
Okay.
Yeah. Couple of questions here. Can you please tell us how the compensation will be handled with the closing attorney? I see there being two commission statements. For anybody who practices in Massachusetts, I see it being a lot like Massachusetts, where both sides are being paid out of on the CD, out of through the transaction of the closing attorney. I don't see the money flowing to the listing brokerage and then to the buyer's brokerage much anymore. It's still possible that it could go that people could transact that way. I just don't see that being the norm. Rep disclosure. What happens if the seller agrees to pay the buyer's agent and finds out the buyer's agent also being paid by the buyer? We're gonna deal with that in the person's sale agreement in a minute. Nah. We are allowed to amend our buyer's broker if a higher amount is offered with permission of the buyer. Correct. So Deborah, the answer is correct. Yes. If a buyer contacts the listing agent, can we ask if they have a signed agreement? You can ask, but you can't demand to see it, and everybody is supposed to have one.
Yeah, it's the same thing on the listing side, right? If you suspect that somebody has a listing and they don't have an agreement, you call the MLS and we enforcement, but you don't have a right to see somebody's listing agreement.
Correct. Yep. Can you have the seller compensate you as the listing brokerage, for example? I'm not going to use a number. I'm not going to read it.
Thank you, Ryan.
Then the listing broker pay the buyer agent a percentage of their compensation with the seller. The answer is yes. Angela, so Angela's question, can you have the seller compensate you as a listing brokerage, for an example, X%, then the listing brokerage pay the buyer's agent? Yeah, but that's what's being completely in question here. So, I mean, you're not really changing the process, and that is exactly what the Department of Justice does not want to see. Andy, can you ask for confirmation of representation of buyers?
Yep.
We
answered that one.
So
yeah.
Doesn't affect the commercial market, so I wouldn't worry about it. We answered that.
Right. Did we make that clear? I know I had a question and I answered that, but I want to be clear because it gets confusing because, hey, I thought we were talking about residential, but then we're talking about compensation. So regarding compensation, that applies to all property types, right? No compensation on any listings of no matter what the property type is or status in the MLS. That's across the board. The only thing that's specific to this residential or this notion of touring a home is the mandatory agreement with buyers. So I just wanted to make sure we clarify that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think
Cheryl
related to
had a-
that, sorry, if just related to what John was just asked about.
Yeah.
If whether the buyer rep agreements needed to show commercial properties or multifamilies. And no, there's nothing that requires you to use a written buyer representation agreement if you're showing commercial property or larger multi-unit properties.
Right. It's
of
1 to 4
that.
families, right? I think it's 1 to 4 families.
Right. I mean, is it a good idea? Yes, to protect yourself and make
It
sure you
doesn't
get
hurt,
paid.
right? Yeah.
And
Like,
to spell it out, but it's not required as part of the settlement agreement.
And they said 1 to 4 families. Does it affect residential vacant land? Do we know?
It's not a home. You can unless you can pitch a tent, right? I mean, no, I don't think it's a home.
No,
Yeah.
it's just the units themselves. Yeah.
All right, let's so the next thing is the
Okay.
amendment. We should
Yep.
move ahead, right?
Yep,
So
absolutely.
let's press on to
The person said, yeah, absolutely. So the
Right.
amendment to the exclusive buyer rep agreement, this is a brand new form. Again, it's an amendment, John, if you don't want to pull it up.
there it is.
If you already are, it's okay. But it's an amendment just like the last few amendments we've shown that are brand new. And rather than for those who want to amend their compensation, for those who want to amend the term, or whatever they want to amend within the exclusive buyers rep agreement, you can use this amendment rather than starting from scratch with a brand new contract.
And this is, and by the way, let me ask you this question. I mean, this isn't mandatory. So if you're using our listing agreement and you want to amend your contract some other way, you don't have to use this if you're amending your agreement, right? It's more or less we've added this as a benefit or convenience.
Yep, correct.
Okay.
And none of the forms that we're showing you are mandatory. And like I said, some brokerages have said, well, can we just develop our own forms? I would say that, absolutely you can do that. What I would say though, is if you're having an attorney or just doing it or trying to do it on your own, develop your own forms, you want to make sure that whoever's doing that has thoroughly read the settlement agreement,
Right.
including all the practice changes, because frankly, you don't want to go off on your own and have get sued. Because I do need to be a buzzkill, which is part of my job, I guess. But the thing is, there's a settlement agreement for sellers, class action lawsuits brought by sellers. But there's not one yet for buyers. And another class action lawsuit was filed by buyers just actually late last week. So, and like I said, the Department of Justice is paying close attention, as are the plaintiffs' attorneys. The plaintiffs' attorneys in the MLS PIN case are based right out of Boston. So I know a lot of people are thinking, okay, it's fine. Someone's looking at California or Massachusetts or a bigger state, but it's not like way out of someone's way from Boston. So that's why I just say you all got to decide your brokerage. You as brokers have to decide what level of risk you're comfortable with. But just, we don't want anything to happen to any of you. We're not aware of anyone, at least within the state of Rhode Island. Certainly some national brokerages have been sued, which is a shame. But
to Monica's point, I mean, understanding the settlement, the actual settlement, I mean, like really reading it is really important because all of a sudden everybody's an expert, right? There are a lot of junior lawyers out there posting these things on social media and giving some bad advice. So, you really want to make sure that, as Monica said, that you're working with an attorney that they're really familiar with the settlement. Okay, so now this one's going to be a whopper, right? This one should take some time. The PNS agreement.
Correct.
Nice and big.
Nice and big.
Hopefully.
Section 18.
18. All right. Hopefully I don't make everybody dizzy as I scroll down here. Sorry. Here we go.
All right. Section 18 is a brand new section to the agreement. And so this is what you would use if you are asking, or I'm sorry, if your buyer is asking the seller to pay your compensation as a buyer's agent. So it says that this agreement is subject to seller paying the cooperating brokerage the following professional service fees upon the closing and recording of the deed for transfer of property. And you would check all that apply. So the first would either be a flat figure dollar amount. The second would be a percentage of the gross sales price. or it could be another, you know, there could be another, and you would check that box if there was another. Buyer, so section B, and a lot of questions have come up from here, is the buyer will or will not be compensating the cooperating broker according to a separate buyer contract. Compensation shall be paid upon the closing and recording of the deed. So if the buyer is paying, and the reason why we put this in here is because this is what the lenders are going to need to see, because if the buyer is paying, it becomes cash to close. And in order for the buyer to be approved for the loan, the lender needs to know how much cash is coming. Does the buyer have the money to transact? So the lender is able to see this, and if the lender sees that the box is will, it's kind of a stopgap for the lender to ask the buyer and or the buyer's agent to ask how much money the buyer is paying. The dollar figure doesn't affect the contract. That's why there's not a dollar figure in the purchase and sale agreement, but it is very important that the lender is aware if the buyer is paying their own compensation, their own cooperating broker compensation. Section C, cooperating broker will or will not receive compensation from more than one party. You would check the will or the will not box. Here is your disclosure that puts you in compliance with the code of ethics. And you know, remember that the seller could be paying some of it and the buyer could be paying the rest of it. So you would check the will box if multiple people were paying the compensation listed out in your buyer's rep agreement. And D is just saying that cooperating brokerage is intending to be a third-party beneficiary of this agreement. To remember that brokers were never parties. This is an agreement between the seller and the buyer, and in order for the broker to collect or be a party to the contract, we had to make you a party of the contract. So that is what D is doing. I'm sure the questions will flow in now. Anonymous, are buyers using this as a closing cost? It is absolutely possible that you could do it as a closing cost. You would use the additional provision sections for your closing costs like you do today. Where can we find copies? Monica or John, I'll let you answer that later, what we're gonna do. We're gonna
Yeah, I
send out.
just put that in chat,
Okay.
where the resources are. So if you want to see, one person posted that he does have a copy of the settlement agreement already, but just wondering, like, you know, what parts to look at, where to go. Everything having to do with this, whether it's the video of today's program, PowerPoint, frequently asked questions about the settlement agreement, all of that are posted on the link that I have here. I know our communications department's going to yell at me because I've forgotten the shorter version of this.
It's RIARealtors.org/CPR. It's
Okay,
CPR.
John,
How can you forget that?
in.
It's
You type
commission.
that in since you're so
I don't even know what
smart.
CPR stands for. I forget, but it's CPR. How do you forget that? All right, I'll type it in the chat.
Okay. All right, go ahead, Ryan.
Josh's question, others that where you can specify being paid on the net, absolutely. You could write in there that you could absolutely put that in there if you wanted to. I saw a lot of questions earlier about, do I need the buyer's rep agreement if I'm simply just sending emails? And the answer is no. The answer is you need the buyer's rep agreement signed before you enter a property or before you tour the property.
Right. There's two things. I mean, sort of like the sending properties was what was, you know, acting as a broker, right, or providing professional services, but it's before touring a home. You're right. So those are two things that have to go together. It's not just, oh, I'm doing these things on this list over here. It's you're doing this, you know, prior to touring a home. So
yeah, you should have your mandatory relationship disclosure signed, but you don't need to have the buyer's rep agreement signed until the tour.
Right. But, you know, there's no reason, I suppose, if you wanted to be cautious and enter into it earlier, you know, and again, we're not talking about the full rep agreement, but if you just wanted them to sign off on sort of those caveats that are required under the settlement, you know, just to better protect yourself and not take the chance, you certainly could, right? You're just not mandated, right?
a question here is if a buyer comes directly to the listing agent without a buyer's broker, can the listing agent ask the buyer for compensation to handle their paperwork, or must the listing agent get compensation from the seller? No, you could absolutely ask that buyer. You would be a transaction facilitator. We haven't gotten to that form yet. But you could absolutely ask that buyer that you would represent as a transaction facilitator to compensate you for those services.
You know, one thing to keep in mind about all these, about the buyer representation contract and, just forgot where I'm going with that. Okay, never mind, carry on.
Well, you're talking about dual agency or potentially facilitator, right? Maybe.
Yeah.
No?
I forgot.
She lost her train of thought. All right, let me go on because we've got, 30
Go
minutes.
ahead,
We've got a number
Ryan,
of
yeah.
forms. So the
Yeah,
next
but,
one is the letter of intent, right?
Yeah. Bethany's question is, do we need a signed relationship disclosure? Absolutely. Nobody's taking the relationship disclosure out. Always need a mandatory relationship disclosure. Anonymous attendee, is there a form for touring a home? Yes, what you would use is the buyer's rep agreement.
And that, Ryan, you might want to comment on that. I mean, the buyer's rep agreement, that can be for a day.
Yes, somebody
No,
asked
for-
that question. That can be for a specific house. It can be for a specific timeline. It does not have to be for a long period of time. It can be for one day. It can be for one house. It can be for 1 week. It can be whatever you and your client want it to be. And then why we created that amendment is so that you didn't have to, if somebody only wanted to do a buyer rep agreement for every single property, you could just continue to extend the timeline with the amendment rather than doing a brand new contract every single time with that person.
Right.
Good advice.
Lise has a question. If this back on just on the PNS, I'll go to that. You don't have to change it, John. Is the seller paying, as in section 18, considered making a concession? I would say no. And therefore limited. No, I would say if you're asking for a closing cost credit, then you should be putting that in the additional provisions like we always have them.
So one thing, and I do want to make sure that, just in maybe about 10 minutes or so, that we go back to some of the questions at the very beginning.
Sure.
So we're kind of looking at the more current questions first. So I want to make sure that they don't get
Yeah,
too
we're
frustrated.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next is the letter of intent. We can go through this real quick. This exactly mimics, so section 9, John, if you scroll down. Section 9 mimics exactly what we just saw in the purchase and sale agreement. It's just if you're using the letter of intent or to make an offer, you have that availability to be asking the seller to pay that compensation in the letter of intent. Or I know a lot of people use the purchase and sale agreement to be making their offer on. Whichever direction you want to go in, it's the same exact language regarding compensation to the buyer's broker. And up next is the exclusive tenant representation agreement.
Okay.
And Ryan and John, while you're scrolling down, I just want to quickly mention, I saw a theme in some of the earlier questions where basically is this whole thing with the Department of Justice, are they going to lose? Is this all going to go away? I guess Warren Buffett said something along those lines. Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is like, if you go to, if for any of you who go to a casino, do you put $10,000 on a roulette table and a number? I mean, it really is all about risk. Personally, I'm not holding my breath to see if the Department of Justice is overruled, because I think by the time something like that winds its way through court, that could be years and we'll already have changes in the practice. But it really, like I said before, it's all about what level of risk you and your brokerage are comfortable with. Some people like to be squarely within requirements. Other people push the envelope, and we can't make that decision for you. So, okay, go ahead. I stalled long enough.
No worries. So the exclusive tenant agreement, it's section 9 that's been changed. this is the same form as the exclusive buyer's representation agreement, just regarding if you're dealing with a tenant in a rental situation, and Section 9 mimics exactly what we already talked about in the exclusive buyer rep agreement. You don't need to pull these up, John. The next two is just the termination of the exclusive tenant representation agreement. We did not have a termination of that form, so we created one, and it mimics the termination of the exclusive buyer rep agreement. It just, again, deals with tenant representation and not buyer representation. And same thing with the next form, is an amendment to the exclusive tenant representation agreement, and it is exactly that, just an amendment. Rather than using a blanket amendment, we created one that exactly mimics the amendment to the buyer's rep agreement, again, only dealing with tenants.
All right, so cooperating broker rental compensation, is that the next one?
Yep, that's the next one.
Boom. There we go.
Perfect. So this is a new form, and because in a rental situation, you don't necessarily have a purchase and sale agreement that you can be asking the landlord to compensate. The tenant doesn't, in the lease, you're not going to do that. So this is a specific form that if you are representing a tenant and that tenant is asking the landlord to compensate you as the cooperating broker, you would fill out this form at filling that, and it mimics what's in the purchase and sale agreement for depending on who's paying, how much they're paying, if you're being paid by more than one party. And again, it's making the brokerage an intended third party of this agreement. This is the same language that we put in the purchase and sale agreement in the letter of intent, just dealing with rentals if you're representing a tenant.
So it's a pretty small form.
Yeah, it's one
pretty
page.
simple. Yep.
And by the way, we realize this is a lot to digest. So one of our John's and my colleagues, Ann Enos from Professional Development, wanted us to let you know that she'll be taking video clips, and actually we're putting together short video clips about each form. So I'm recording some things later on this week. We'll put together some more talking points about each form, because we know this is an awful lot to digest, and I'm impressed Ryan's gotten through as many forms as he has in this short period of time so far.
All good. So this next one is a brand new form. This is your exclusive showing and compensation agreement if you're going to be a transaction facilitator for the buyer. So the first one that we talked about is your exclusive, where you're a designated client representative for the buyer. If you choose to be, well, not if you choose, if, for example, a buyer, an unrepresented buyer wants to see your listing, or if the unrepresented buyer comes to your open house and wants to make an offer, you would then be representing that person as a transaction facilitator. And most importantly, and back to the question about compensation, can you ask that person to compensate you? Yes, you can. And you would need to have this filled out if they're compensating you. Correct me if I'm wrong, Monica, but if they are not compensating you and they want to make an offer, you do not need to have an agreement with that person.
Correct.
Okay, so this form will only be used in two situations. If one, a buyer client chooses to only have you be a transaction facilitator for them, or if by default you become a transaction facilitator and they're going to compensate you for those cases of they are wanting to make an offer on your own listing. Follows exactly along as the buyer's rep agreement, the exclusive buyer's rep agreement, where you are a designated client representative for said buyer. Just takes out the designated client representative and some of the duties that are owed, with the difference between you being a designated client representative and a transaction facilitator.
That it? Okay. And so obviously it's still the same. All right, good.
Yeah. And then the last one is the same exact form. It's just a non-exclusive. So you can have a non-exclusive showing and compensation agreement if you choose to. And you would use this form, and a buyer could sign this with multiple agents is the biggest caveat here. So a buyer could sign this with multiple people, but if that buyer wanted to have a non-exclusive relationship with you as a transaction facilitator, this is the form that you would use, and it mimics the form that we just had up on the screen.
So why might one choose to use this versus the other one, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I will say the forms committee and even the exec committee were split pretty much down the middle as to whether this was necessary or not necessary. So we made the decision to offer both. And some people said that they would use this if they didn't really know the buyer yet, if they were just seeing if they wanted to work with the buyer, but you have to have something signed with compensation if you're going to be showing them the
Right.
property.
So in other words, some of the feedback we've heard early on with this is, how am I going to get a buyer to sign anything? They're just going to go directly to the listing office or whatever. So this is a form that sort of you feel is maybe more approachable because it's not creating exclusivity with that buyer. So they might be more inclined to sign something with you. Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair.
Good.
Perfect. So that is it. So if we want to go through the questions.
Yes, let's do that. Okay, let's go through some of the earlier ones. No particular order. Some I answered, I clicked as answered because you addressed them in the purchase and sales agreement, Ryan.
Yeah.
Okay, so probably a big theme is well, I'm gonna take one of them is how does the Department of Justice propose or expect realtors to receive payment? Are we expected to work for free? And I think you've answered that one, Ryan, which is no. Regardless of whatever thoughts you might have about the Department of Justice or anybody else around, no, you're not expected to work for free, and hopefully we've shown some new tools for negotiation. So with using the purchase and sales agreement. I did see some comments earlier about the purchase and sales agreement where people are saying like, I thought you couldn't put compensation in the purchase and sales agreement. Yes, you can. And under the old system, you couldn't use the purchase and sales agreement to change what the listing broker is offering. But a buyer could always request compensation be paid by the seller.
An old question
ahead.
here too is if I have a deal starting in July with regular compensation and closing at the end of August, I assume this is still being honored. That's correct. If up until August 13th, you'll see compensation in MLS, and if you go under contract on August 13th or beforehand, then that compensation will still be honored as we know it.
Right.
Although I would
There's no
suggest
get out of jail free card. You can't say, oh, the clock's ticked, I don't have to pay you now. Right.
Yeah. Monica, you were gonna say.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I was just gonna say, but and I agree with what both of you just said, but what I would say is if if you're the buyer's rep or a cooperating broker, I would still like follow up with some, whether it's email or something like that. I would just follow up to confirm. Just because the compensation fields will go away, so you just want to make sure that
Print out the MLS sheet before August 14th.
yeah, like a belt and suspenders approach doesn't hurt here. So
Lisa had a good question here. If you add your buyer agreement, if you add to your buyer agreement the amount, oh boy, I lost it. If you add to the buyer agreement the amount of the compensation you put in X and you only get the seller to agree to pay Y, are you able to accept, and it was a lower amount, are you able to accept the lower amount? And are you not required to make your buyer make up the difference? I would say that's a personal decision. No, you're not required to make them make up the difference. That's a contract between you and your buyer, and however you decide to perform on that is perfectly fine. She says, I know you can not get more than what you asked for, but can you take less? Yes, you can definitely take less. Doug Bennett, can compensation be a percentage versus it can be either. It can be a percentage or a firm dollar amount. It can be whatever that you agree with between you and your buyer client.
and one thing I'll just mention about the percentage, I'm not telling you have to ditch percentages. I'm just saying that one of the things that came up in the first lawsuit, the Sitzer-Burnett case, and some of the comments the Department of Justice have made is if you're a buyer's rep, is it a conflict of interest for you to get paid more depending on how much the buyer pays for the house? And before everybody sends me hateful messages in the chat or in the Q&A, I'm just saying that is an issue that came up. So if you were thinking of making a switch to a different type of approach for combination, no time like the present. But that's entirely up to you and your brokerage.
So Does touring a home include a buyer attending an open house? No, it doesn't. You do not have to have anything signed with that buyer to let that buyer come into your open house. Eric's question, so if someone calls us and asks us to send them homes that match their needs, do you need to sign a contract? No, it's before you show them any of those houses, you need to have that. Same question by Anonymous there.
And then we also have the question that came, John answered a few questions about concessions before, but the question about the concession fields before, John, it could be for closing costs, so the buyer could pay for the broker instead.
Mm-hmm. So the concession field could be for closing costs, and yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we really want to steer clear, because I have to say,
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, I mean, that's the problem is you can't, I mean, the concessions, an offer of concessions can't just be a sort of a clever way to offer compensation, right? I mean, that's
right.
That's just going to get us in trouble.
The Department of Justice is going to look at us.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it can be recorded afterwards because we have a place after a listing is sold where you can record concessions related to a transaction.
So anonymous, could a buyer embed compensation for their realtor into their mortgage? I've talked to a few mortgage people. The answer is I'm not aware of how you would get it in your mortgage. And from what I'm told, no mortgage bankers have said that anybody's working on a way to make that happen either. So not at this time.
Now, one tip I would say, and actually I've heard this from lenders, so I can't take credit for it, but a good tip is if you're a cooperating broker, talk to the buyer's lender as early as possible in the transaction. Because keep in mind, the lenders, this is, as we're dealing with all these changes, so are the lenders, so are the closing attorneys. So you probably want to err on the side of over communicating. And if you know that you're going to be building this, or there's a good chance you'll be building compensation into the purchase and sales agreement, does the lender have any preferences? Do they want to see, is there anything that would set off alarm bells for them? Is there anything that would affect the amount that the buyer can qualify for? So you want to have all those conversations early on so you're not caught by surprise. Because as someone had pointed out before, you're not here just doing this for your health. I mean, you're professionals. You deserve to be paid for the work that you're doing.
Okay, there's several sort of commission listing related ones here. Let me bang out 3 of these here in a row. So first, if you have a listing showing a commission prior to the 14th, will it be grandfathered in? Again, if the listing is active on the 14th, there'll be no longer compensation, right, showing in the listing. And as mentioned earlier, you would need to get that amendment form signed by your seller.
Yes.
If it's pending, then you would have to honor the compensation. Will still be removed from the listing, but you would, if the deal goes through, you would be required to compensate the cooperative broker as procuring cause. So this one says, so can we state seller concessions without naming a figure or a percentage? Yeah, you can. I mean, you can state concessions with a figure. They just need to be for concessions. They can't be, a way of just, cleverly trying to say, it's cooperative compensation. So, I mean, if a seller is offering concessions, you can say seller is offering concessions. And if the seller is offering blank amount or blank percent concession, you can do that. It's just, you need to be very careful. It can't be seen as a way of offering cooperative compensation. And the
John,
last one,
on that note, John, I know you got one more on that same topic, but I just want to quickly mention, John, I think you were the one who had sent me a link to a podcast where someone from the California Association of Realtors, or from their multiple listing service, which does have concession fields. Someone kind of did a little surreptitious, like an undercover study to see what people were putting in those fields. And they all kind of seemed to turn out to be certain percentages that fell within a certain range. So
I mean, that's the problem. So
they're not dopes.
They're not idiots. They're going to come. And like I mentioned early on, if 3 years from now, and they start looking at why things haven't changed in their mind, they're going to start looking for who to blame, and they're going to see this thing and they're going to, oh, well, here we go. Okay. So the last one, what about putting the compensation on your website? Will that be allowed? You can, if you're offering on your listings compensation, you can put it on your website. You can put it on your social media. So that is permissible.
Well, under the settlement agreement, right? But not.
Yeah. Well, we're not advising you. I mean, under the, all those DOJ cautions that we sort of put in there, right. You might not want to, but, it's not prohibited under the settlement.
So during the ABR course with NAR, it was informed to us that we can in fact receive commission fees from the seller, seller's agent, and buyers in the same transaction as long as it does not exceed the amount stipulated in the agreement. Is that correct? That is correct. I was previously under the impression we could only collect fees from one party during one transaction. No, you can collect fees from multiple parties. It just has to be disclosed to all parties in writing, and that's why we put that in the purchase and sale agreement, so that we took care of the disclosure for you. If there's a listing agreement on a property and the property does not go under agreement by 8/17, are we to assume we need new listing contracts with newly discussed compensation? No, I mean, it is one way to do it, or you can use the amendment and write in
Right.
what needs to be written in the amendment. Either direction would be fine. Can we write seller is flexible with buyer or just flexible? I think we answered that earlier.
And John, do you have anything else to add to that one, or?
Not really. I mean, again, there are certain things you can, but you still need to be sort of cautious, and we're going to be, as we, we'll be, when we see certain things show up, we're going to be contacting listing offices and just ask, what do you mean by this? What is this really, that type of thing. So,
So looking at the time, it looks like we've got about
yeah.
6 minutes left. So we'll get through as many as we can. I hope we'll try and bunch together some.
Yeah. We already answered that one. What would the exact wording be? Deb's question on the buyer's agreement. Can I put the provisions in the case of the listing not offering? I would walk into every deal, Deb, as they're not offering any compensation. So, in that you're going to be asking you may be asking the seller to compensate. The buyer may be asking. So is NAR's goal to get us to offer any buyer? Is it NAR's goal to get us not to offer buyer compensation as the listing? I'm not going to say it's NAR's goal because it's okay, part of the settlement agreement. It's the Department of Justice's goal that there would be no compensation, no uniform compensation being offered.
And let me just mention, I mean, kind of the rationale for this, and sometimes I feel like I'm sounding like a mouthpiece for the Department of Justice. Absolutely not my intent. But yeah, the issue that you have with that is the Department of Justice, and frankly, the plaintiff's attorneys, their concern is steering. So in the case that we saw in Sitzer Burnett with the nearly $5.4 billion with a B dollar judgment, the issue was that sellers were testifying in court that they didn't know that they could negotiate compensation. They were told that they had, if they did know that they were paying a cooperating broker, which a lot said they didn't, they were told, well, if you don't pay them this, if you don't offer this, no one's going to show your house. So I don't know, Ryan or John, I mean, I can answer it too, but I want to get, but Ryan, like if I were a seller, and a seller said, well, why would I want to pay anything to a cooperating broker?
Mm-hmm.
What's the answer? What kind of, or, without getting into steering, but what would be?
Yeah, way to throw them under a bus, Well,
I can
by the
answer
way,
it
it's being
too.
recorded, so maybe don't answer that question.
Yeah.
Be careful.
Okay, I'm sorry. All right, I'll answer it. I was just trying to give you a shot too, because I know you do a lot of training. No, I mean, it sounds like you're kind of really it sounds like splitting hairs, and it really is. But the difference is, the shortcut is that you do not want to do is say, if you don't agree to pay a cooperating broker, no one is going to, no one's going to buy your house. No one's going to want to see your house, etc. But what is okay to do is to say, and you'll see that in some pieces that we're putting out. It is okay to say, sellers, you should probably be aware that, and you can use what Ryan showed you in the listing contract, saying like, hey, sellers, don't be surprised if a buyer might be asking you for concessions and or compensation for their broker. But you can say, look, most buyers are not in the position to pay a buyer's rep out of pocket, or anyone who's working with them, a cooperating broker, out of pocket. And as we're just talking about the financing issues, for the most part, we haven't heard of anyone who's willing to put it in as a finance cost. You could check with individual lenders on that. But really focusing on so sellers, we're concerned that could really limit the pool of people who are interested in, who are not actually interested in, but who are able to purchase your property, because it's helpful for them to have representation. In my experience, maybe I could say, the transaction goes more smoothly that way if the buyers are represented. whatever, but you just want to make sure that it's tied to, how does this affect the seller other than peer pressure? Everybody's doing this, so you can't be the odd one out.
So regarding the forms, I don't know if you mentioned it, that, you did mention that we didn't want to push them out till we had training, but is there a release date for the forms? A lot of people are asking if the forms are available. Some people are asking, can we start using them now? And I guess they could technically, once they become available, you could use the forms now if you wanted to. But when are they going to be available, Monica?
It really just depends on the forms vendor. We've asked them all for August 1st, but in advance to that, you'll see like the information that Ryan was going over. We're taking those apart into kind of smaller video snippets, articles, just with talking points about what has changed in the form, to see them that way. So as far as like the full form goes, I know, John, I think you'd offered a solution if they weren't ready in time from the vendors, because we don't want you to just get these on August 14th, obviously. We want you to be able to walk through, do training, more training, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, they've been distributed to the vendors. So some, like you said, have pushed them. I think that they will be live, but worst case scenario, we can make them available in a share file, PDF versions. We're not going to do that yet, but after the 1st of August, I guess, if your particular platform doesn't have it yet, then we could do that. Is that fair, Monica?
It is.
All
And
right.
with 1 minute to go, does anyone have any final comments you'd like to share?
No, I guess my comment is doing these things in the morning is a lot easier. I get really woozy in the afternoon. This is tough.
Well, we did do that because every time we had the ones that weren't recorded, we'd invariably have someone who was working another job just say like,
Right.
hey, how come we can't see this? So we thought we'd try it later in the day. But yeah, I think, you probably heard this say this before, but I mean, you as realtors, regardless of when you got into the profession, you've weathered all kinds of challenges. And I know I'm one of those cockeyed optimists, but if anybody is going to be able to pull this off and persevere, it's going to be all of you. We're here to help you. I don't want to volunteer Ryan's services since he already has a full-time job elsewhere, but please feel free to contact John or me, reach out to our professional development department, anyone on the staff. We really are here to help you because we want you to weather what are some challenging times where we're all kind of trying to figure out what do we do, what comes next.
I think also, I haven't mentioned this to you, Monica, or anyone else, but I'm just going to whip it out here. But I think also it might be a good idea, maybe 1 week before, the 14th, we do one more of these drop-ins, these last-minute drop-ins for any final, like, okay, we're almost there. Any questions? Let's, maybe spend the majority of it just answering questions, at that point. So might be a good idea to do that.
But just let us know how we can help you. And I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all the questions, but I think we made a pretty decent dent. And thank you all for joining us today. Watch for the recording. I did put the link, or actually John put the link in chat. But if you just go to RIAR.org and look for the
/CPR.
/CPR. Just go there and the video will be there. I'll say a couple of days. I don't know how long it'll take our communications department. But again, thank you for joining us. And thank you so much for our special guest, our Forms Committee Chair, Ryan Antrop.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Appreciate what all of you and the committee members did. Like I said, volunteers took a lot of guts to take the approach that you did. And best of luck to everybody.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, over and out. Take care.